Welcome back to another video on the no input mixing board. Today I want to talk about a couple of approaches that I've taken to limit the output levels of my no input mixing board. I'm going to talk about the main way that I approach this using a Zoom H5 recorder, but I'm also going to show two other ways that I've considered approaching this that I think are equally interesting to consider as well. I find some form of limiting to be a very important part of working with feedback circuits because the output level can vary a lot and can get very loud very quickly. If you're not careful, then you can surprise yourself, and one of the easiest ways to damage your ears or your equipment when working with potentially loud sources is to surprise yourself. Limiting strategies are useful because they create a hard upper bound to the potential volume or output level that you can get from your instrument. Here I have the Mackie 1202 running into the Zoom H5's 1 and 2 inputs, and I have a couple of settings on here that I'm using to limit those inputs and make them suitable for input into the Zoom recorder. The settings that I have on my recorder are a -20 dB pad on the 1 and 2 inputs, and then the limiter engaged for those channels. I'll show you how I set those up. So accessing the menu, I'm going to go to the in and out section here. And there are a few options that are useful. There's a low cut, which you can put on your tracks. I currently don't have a low cut engaged, but depending on how you're recording and what you're recording, it might make sense to put an 80 hertz or 100 hertz low cut on your inputs. But the important one here is the compressor / limiter. On channels 1 and 2, I have the general limiter engaged. There are 3 different limiter settings. The differences between them for this application are not particularly significant, so I'm just using the general limiter. In the input-output settings here is also where the pad option is. This brings the levels down and makes the output of my mixing board more suitable as an input to the Zoom recorder. As you might have been able to see in the opening to this video, I can push the volume very loud on my mixing board and not exceed a level that I want to be recording into my recorder. My headphones are plugged into my computer right now. But when I'm not recording into my computer, I'm able to plug into the side of the recorder here and set the level on my recorder separate from the input that's going in to make sure that I'm listening at a comfortable level at any time. In order to find the level that I want my mixing board recorded in here on the dials, I start with them low, bring my mixer up, and try and make sure that I'm peaking somewhere in between -12 and -6. Another way to approach limiting for a mixing board is to run it into another device, such as another mixing board here, that can attenuate the final output levels and ensure that they never cross a threshold of excess. This is performing the same role as my recorder would be of controlling the final output level separate from the instrument that I'm working with. I set the level for a mixer similar to how I set it for the recorder. I can start with the output at a low level, bring my mixing board up to its maximum loudness, and then bring the level up on my mixer to a point where it feels comfortable and appropriate to be listening at. Going on a slight field trip around to the side of my desk, I wanted to show a third setup for limiting the output of the mixing board that I've been playing around with a little bit. Here I have a DBX rack mount compressor and EQ that I've been experimenting with running my mixing board into with fairly good results. The compressor slash limiter is set up in stereo mode right now, and the graphic EQ has both channels set the same as a stereo EQ. Right now the noise gate is engaged on both channels, which is why they're showing maximum compression, but I'm going to go ahead and turn on the mixing board so that we can hear it and see how the front panels on these two rack mount pieces of equipment are responding to the mixing board. Here we are with the mixing board at a fairly standard level, and you can see that with these settings here, we're triggering about 6 dB of compression and not doing much output adjustment on the EQ to get our final output levels. Coming in on the compressor for a moment, you can see that I'm playing with about a 4:1 ratio of compression, fairly slow attack time. I'm putting the output levels down just a couple of dB, and I have the limiter engaged to keep the levels down just a little bit here. On the EQ, I'm playing around with just a bit of subtractive EQ, cutting from around 6K onward on the highs, and cutting on the lows down at the sort of sub-audio range there at 25. Really driving the mixing board for a moment here, you can see that the compression increases, and at this point we are triggering the limiter a little bit. And this is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing in this scenario. You can see that the output levels coming out of the EQ are right about where they were with our lower level input into the system. Compared to the other two methods, this one is a little more complicated, but I think in the end gives the best results. The H5 is probably the easiest and my favorite approach for limiting the output on the mixing board. The biggest downside to the H5 recorder is that it's a little more complicated to run the mixing board then into other pieces of equipment instead of going straight into a recording device. With these, I have a lot more flexibility for how I integrate the mixing board with other pieces of equipment while having a lot of peace of mind doing that. I hope that these three approaches can give you some ideas for how you might limit the output of your mixing board. I don't think that there's a single right way to approach recording or monitoring the output levels of a feedback system like a no-input mixing board, and I certainly don't have the full experience to recommend a single way of doing this. But I hope that some of these approaches that I've shown here and experimented with are useful if you're looking to find your own way to do this.